Today I offer you a patchwork of woven concepts and thoughts that I've been carefully stitching together over this year with the joint effort, help, and support of many people in this room, and one person who is not in this room today, Saskia Byler, but is with us virtually, I hope. Please someone check on that. I submit that this is a condensed version of my written work. As Miguel said, I'm part of the Theories program. And so I hope that what little I can offer in visuals, I can make up with in words. So this is a study of the relationship between two sites, and most fundamentally how they are valued in relation to each other. The Antimalavia, Anti-Wonder, Mercado San Roque, and the Historic Center, emblematic of Quito's status as a World Heritage Site. Do I need to use this clicker? In a popular city poll in 2011, the San Roque market was voted the Antimaravilla of Quito. The disorder, congestion, and dangers of the market were cited as evidence for this result. By contrast, the order, cleanliness, and colonial aesthetic of the Historic Center has been preserved through massive rehabilitation plans since the 1990s, and preservation efforts have regulated forms of labor in that site, such as informal vending and sex work. In this study, this is just to give you a sense of how close the market is in relation to some of the most prominent tourist sites in the Historic Center. So in this study, I traced preservation efforts in the center alongside the shifts in Quito's arts and culture scene in the late 20th century, highlighting a convergence between urban social struggles and community practice. This convergence, I suggest, explains the recent attention to the San Roque market based on shared socio-political circumstances. I focus on various related approaches to community practice that come from the arts: mediación comunitaria, which works to link institutions and communities; collective approaches such as arte urbano, as well as activist-led work. I position these approaches in relation to the expanded field of participatory and site-based contemporary art internationally, drawing on the discourse of socially engaged art, as well as theories of political artistic practice, considering how practitioners must negotiate their role and the potential for the community-based approach to visibilize the market in such a way that actually might increase its vulnerability. I believe this study has significance towards models for how artistic practices can ally with particular urban struggles by foregrounding the politics in advance of the art practice's form or aesthetic, and also as a strategy for disrupting the dominance of authorized heritage discourse as institutionalized by global agencies. But firstly, in order to understand the aesthetic and political relationship between these sites, it is vital to work from the recognition that they are valued differently because of the intimate connection between capitalism and urbanization. I cannot take credit for these. This is from an RSA Animate that David Harvey actually narrates based on Crisis of Capitalism. So as good critical urban practitioners, we do know how to approach a discussion of value. We understand, following philosopher Henri Lefebvre and other critical spatial theorists, that space is produced by capitalist social relations and in turn also productive of these social relations. Capital is value in motion, in circulation, in transformation. Understanding it, oh, I guess I scared some people. Understanding it, as Marx demonstrates, requires a dialectical approach. When it comes to space, Marxist geographers have worked to demonstrate that spatial development is not separate to capitalist socio-political relations, but is in fact contingent on them. And this relationship informs further development as capital constantly seeks new forms of expansion. David Harvey has applied Marx's dialectical relation between use and exchange value in order to demonstrate that land use theory is contingent on the capitalist mode of production. Harvey reiterates Marx's description of use value as that which serves a need and is therefore useful in its satisfaction of that need, and exchange value as that proportionate measurement that emerges in transaction. In a capitalist society, the form of the commodity consists of these dual aspects of use value and exchange value, but, as Marx enumerated, commodities have value in relation to other commodities, and thus they hold use value in so much as they are exchangeable. Only by being realized as exchange values can they then be realized as use values. Quote, land is a commodity. Its use will be determined primarily by its exchange value. So this then determines urban form and the allocation of property. So I walk you through this framework of urban land use theory because within this framework, which I rely on, as do my colleagues, the use value of Quito's historic center is based on its exchange value as a World Heritage Site and tourist destination. While the San Roque Market is not primarily a site of exchange value, though the labor and produce that are the metabolism of the market are certainly embedded in the structure. And following the constant need to modify land into productive exchange value that will generate profit, the site of the market garners interest for urban development. This speculation, coupled with the pressure to clean up the city, threatens to displace the market from its current site. This is a still from the film San Roque, Una Casa para Todos, San Roque, A Home for All, created through a joint partnership between the Fundación de Museos de la Ciudad and the Frente Defensa, as Zanny has just mentioned. The text reads, "Here we don't only sell, we transfer knowledge and traditions." This illustrates both the recognition of the market site as a place of exchange and of social value, not a site for exchange. The film itself, as a process, represents the work of mediación comunitaria, an arts-based approach that develops the relationship between museums of the city and communities. Of course, as we well know, there are many facets that contradict and complicate urban land use theory and social relations. So, to excavate these contradictions, I use three complementary theoretical lenses: authorized heritage discourse, politics and aesthetics, and international discourse on socially engaged art practice and critical pedagogy. As such, I believe that this study enters a similar interdisciplinary space to that which art historian Rosalind Deutsche identified in her 1996 text, Evictions, as urban aesthetic or spatial cultural discourse. And these terms resonate with my own attempt here. Laura Jane Smith, heritage scholar and anthropologist, refers to authorized heritage discourse as a hegemonic discourse which is reliant on the power and knowledge claims of technical and aesthetic experts and institutionalized in state cultural agencies and amenity societies. In this case, UNESCO confers this institutionalization in conjunction with the state of Ecuador. The selection of sites necessarily gives preference to certain places over others and presumes consensus when we know consensus is non-existent. As Quiteño historian Eduardo Kingman Garces writes, when we talk about heritage, reference is made to a selective process of valorization of spaces, milestones, tangible and intangible assets, the latter including social memory. Much of the literature on urban heritage sites in Latin America focuses on the discontents of integrating populations within the designated heritage site. Conversely, this study focuses on efforts by various practitioners in the field of arts and culture to validate the market as a social space in ways that do not seek to integrate it within the same value structure as the historic center. So the next theoretical lens. Artists and artistic movements have a particularly crucial stake in the politics of urban space and the politics of aesthetics, as those whose practice most often relies on the perceptual. In order to consider the effects of spatial aesthetic construction and interventions that antagonize this construction on social relations, I turn to philosopher Jacques Rancière's conception of the distribution of the sensible. In the politics of aesthetics, Rancière is concerned with who gets to participate in political experience, based on the access afforded in space, time, visibility and invisibility, speech, and noise. As he points out, politics is dependent on this sensory access. Rancière's axes of aesthetic distribution, such as the visible to the invisible, are useful as a frame to analyze approaches to community practice in the market. Art critic Ben Davis evaluates the philosopher's integrated vision of aesthetic and political spheres, writing, as a critical trope, aesthetic politics is more of an excuse not to be engaged in the difficult, ugly business of non-artistic political activism than it is a way of contributing to it. Davis argues against the assumed integration of the spheres of political activism and art making, or aestheticization, and situates this dilemma within the legacy of avant-garde artistic practices and their relationship to social movements. These two perspectives demonstrate what is at stake in any artistic practice that seeks political efficacy in some form. That was supposed to be the slide that you were seeing this whole time. Well, now you see it. As the third theoretical lens that provides the groundwork for this study, I draw on pedagogical theory and avant-garde artistic practice coming out of Latin America, and its intersection with the international discourse of socially engaged art. Socially engaged art, or SEA, comes out of the broader field known as public art that emerged in the late 20th century in North America and Europe, and is one of a number of terms given to art practice that focuses on social relations. Other terms include participatory art and social practice. Mi-Wen Kwon, scholar of art and architectural history and theory, describes socially engaged art as art in the public interest, as it foregrounds social issues, political activism, and community collaborations. But of course, we know that this can be traced to avant-garde practice in urban sites internationally, although I don't have time to go into that long and rich history. Working with communities as a form of art practice seemingly evades the logic of the traditional object-based art market because the locus of the work is the social interaction, engagement, or process rather than the final product. In Quito, the prevalence of this form of practice can be attributed to an absent market for gallery art, as well as to the discourse of critical pedagogy found throughout Latin America, heavily influenced by Paulo Freire. A key voice in this field is that of New York-based artist and director of adult and academic programs at the MoMA, Pablo Helguera. In his text, Education for Socially Engaged Art, Helguera writes, "Socially engaged art functions by attaching itself to subjects and problems that normally belong to other disciplines, moving them temporarily into a space of ambiguity." Helguera points out that one critical aspect of social practice is a renunciation of the singular artist's role and the traditional function that comes with that. This requires attending to the specific form of labor that is constituted by art. Helguera's text acts as a kind of manual for best practices, and in this way, it's sort of similar to the kind of manual one might receive after starting a new job. In 2014, Arte Actuo Flaxo, which is a branch of Flaxo, Facultad Latinoamericana de Ciencias Sociales, sponsored the third Ibero-American meeting on art, labor, and economy in Quito. That first title is from their second meeting. One of the developments of this forum was a text of best practices, specifically focused on community practice, art practice. This document offers guiding concepts with this field. The manual describes Práctica Artística Comunitaria, or community art practice, as a creative process, reflexive and relational, based on collaboration and collective dialogue that locates itself within specific contexts and locations. So this last lens is actually where this study began, with the partnership of myself and Saskia Weiler, my fellow Theories of Urban Practice student. We paired based on a shared interest and background in art history, theory, and political artistic practice, especially Saskia, who has done previous work in this field and at the time was working with the Verilis Center for Art and Politics. As some of you who were here for the presentation in December may remember, the concept of caretaking or urban curating was a guiding aspect in this first joint research phase. And it allowed us to understand some of the ethical and emotional motivations of the practitioners when we did our fieldwork. But we found that this term was maybe more useful for us as researchers than it was imminent to the people we spoke to. And so, as you'll see, the second phase of this research reveals a shift away from this concept. During the first trip to Quito in October, Saskia and I conducted semi-structured interviews with a range of different practitioners that we located through our contacts in Red de Saberes, as Danny mentioned. Through this network, especially Henar Diaz, a member of Red de Saberes working for the Ministry of Culture, Saskia and I were able to establish local contacts for this study. These semi-structured interviews were prompted with guiding questions that we developed using our preliminary research. And the questions were meant to uncover the ways in which our interviewees described their practice, what was their relation to the community with which they worked, how they viewed their civic role, and whether they considered their practice to constitute a form of caretaking that was necessitated by the lack of recognition for the market. After returning from Quito in late October, Saskia and I transcribed these interviews and then used thematic analysis to compose the interview transcripts, revealing categories and patterns to draw out contradictions and tensions. In a further round of interviews conducted in Quito in January, I was able to deepen my understanding of how the relation between these two sites was constructed through municipal policy and situated with respect to contemporary artistic and social movements, as well as institutional approaches to heritage management. So, while Quito's historic center saw increased investment through rehabilitation plans in the decades since 1978, This has been paralleled by the displacement and neglect of vulnerable populations. Together, these interrelated processes create a tension to which local actors and local cultural actors respond. Art historian Jose Gabriel Navarro, an advocate for historic preservation of churches in the late 19th and 20th century, put forward the vision of Quito's center as a living museum, a characterization that indicates that the center's separation from its social reality actually predates the UNESCO designation. This provides a foundation for the site's contemporary commodification. The integrity of the center's architecture is touted as an example of cultural synthesis from its inception to the present. As mentioned, funding for the first massive rehabilitation project in the 1990s came with the imperative to remove informal activities from the streets as part of the Inter-American Development Bank's conservation policy. So in the midst of these intensified social issues inherited from rapid urban migration, as Zanny and I outlined in the introduction, the 1990s also saw the dissolution of the commercial art and gallery scene in Quito. The decline in a commercial base meant that artists were left with a lack of market to cater to, opening up alternative spaces for practice. Art historian Manuel King-Mengochel argues that this is what made possible a renewed degree of experimentation in artistic practice. As King-Mengochel writes, "We must start from the idea that this crisis meant a change in the way of conceiving artistic production, as the field had to contend with gallery closures and the limited sale of artworks. This provoked a transition from the gallery as the locus of artistic production towards public space in the 2000s. I identify three strands of art space community practice: institutional, collective, and activist-led, but these are by no means restrictive categories. These were imminent to me from the interviews that I did as well as the research. These are all practices rooted in place that respond to urgencia del territorio. Territorial urgency is the demand that emerges from the social context and asks us to position ourselves from our place of work. This positioning comes from the intersecting and complementary influences of critical pedagogy and the weakened art market. Ana Rodriguez, previously the Minister for Culture of Ecuador, as well as a member of the activist network Red de Saberes, and was the director of the Fundación Museo de la Ciudad from 2012 to 2014. In this role, she initiated the approach of mediación comunitaria, which is a term that comes from the management of conflict in social justice practice. In Ecuador, this has been practiced within indigenous rural communities, marginalized urban communities, trade associations, and grassroots groups. In the context of the Fundación, this approach emulates the mediating role between communities and governance, but instead supplants it with communities and cultural centers and institutions. Practically, the key aspect of this approach was the creation of a community mediator position for each of the five main museums in the city. As the Fundación is a public service institution commissioned by the Metropolitan District of Quito, the five main museums managed under this foundation are all either located within the historic center or very proximal to it. Under Ana's leadership, a portion of the budget was committed to community resources for research and participation in order to resolve what was observed as a severing of the institutions from their surroundings. One example of this approach in relation to the market is the development of a video titled San Roque, una casa para todos, which lays out some of the negative sentiments towards the market as seen in newspapers and articles, and counters this rhetoric with a documentary depiction of daily life in the market. This includes dialogue from different people working there who describe the metabolic function of the market, such as Gala Guachimin, president of the Frente. I should also mention this is just one of the multitude of approaches to the market initiated through this approach, and there's some material there for people to look at after. The audiovisual material is an attempt to contribute to the debate on diversity, multiculturalism, the right to work in the city, and the future of the historic center of Quito. The descriptive text also recognizes that the presence of popular and indigenous trade in the city represents a historical struggle, now in tension with heritage policies and disputes over memory or interests related to tourism and urban planning. In drawing attention to the sensory qualities of the market, the project mediates the viewer's experience of it, offering a way through. It is also, notably, more a pedagogical tool than an artistic product per se. The politics of the market are foregrounded before the aesthetics of the video. Incorporating a built-in community mediator position into each institution provides a viable way to lend resources to a particular urban issue. It also works to alleviate some of the dominance of museums and cultural centers as discrete sites of formal cultural and artistic production.